Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. It is the final video of 2024, and I could not, in good faith, close off the year without celebrating the 90th anniversary of what is probably the most famous mystery novel of all time, Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. And I know this has not been my personal favorite, much to the chagrin of many of you who let me know I was wrong when I did my Poirot rankings. And I've sort of come around on this novel. I did very much enjoy my reread of it for this video. Probably the most I've ever enjoyed this book since I first read it. And my issue has always been just like how prominent this book is in the Christie verse. Every time there's a new Christie thing, it's always Murder on the Orient Express. It's sort of been done to death, in my opinion, and it gets a bit stale, but that's not really a reason to knock the novel. And I'll get there, but my opinion of this novel did improve on this reread. And as a reminder, I will give you a spoiler free summary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which point I will let you know it's coming so you can back out because spoilers are fair game from that point forward. I imagine very few people need spoiler warnings for this book, but I will err on the side of caution. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Murder on the Orient Express begins not on the Orient Express, but on the Taurus Express from Aleppo to Stamboul, or Istanbul as we would call it today. Hercule Poirot is in Aleppo, where he saved the French army from a scandal. We are not privy to what the scandal was, but many adaptations have provided different answers for it. He leaves Aleppo on the Taurus Express for Stamboul. The train is practically empty, as it's winter and no one travels in the winter. The only other people on the train are two British citizens, a governess named Mary Debenham, and a retired military man, a Christie staple, Colonel Arbuthnot. Poirot spends most of the journey observing them and finds it odd that these two British strangers act familiar toward each other. He overhears them talking about things like, quote, when it's over, unquote, and I wish you weren't involved, unquote. Mary Debenham worries about the train when it's stopped because she fears missing her connection on the Orient Express, which she says she absolutely must make. Her worry is for nothing because the train is up and running quickly. Poirot arrives in Stamboul, where he intends to stay for a few days as he has never been there before. But upon arrival at his hotel, he receives an urgent message about an update on a case and he has to return to London. He meets his old friend Monsieur Bouc at the hotel. Bouc is the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons, which is the company that operates the Orient Express. Bouc promises Poirot he can board the train because it's empty this time of year anyway, so he doesn't have to worry about not having a reservation or whatever. Also at the hotel is a young American man who is bossed around by an older American man. The man looks kindly in appearance, but Poirot is unsettled by a look he gives him. Poirot compares him to a caged animal that looks beautiful but is vicious and mean on the inside. Poirot and Bouc both sense evil in the older man. Bouc is shocked to learn that somehow the Stamboul Calais car is fully booked. This never happens this time of year, as the car is almost always empty. Bouc pushes to fit Poirot somewhere, and when a Mr. Harris doesn't show up, Poirot takes his spot. Mr. Harris is a clear reference to Charles Dickens. Poirot even mentions this directly. I'm really bad at knowing my Dickens. I think this is a reference to Martin Chuzzlewit. I'm sure someone else knows better than I do. Christie was a very big Dickens fan, much bigger than I am. Poirot has to share a compartment with Hector McQueen until one opens up after the Belgrade stop. Hector McQueen is the young American man from the hotel, and he is not happy about having to share his compartment. He thought he had it all to himself, but he's nice to Poirot. He also gets very excited when he learns Poirot is only staying to Belgrade, and then seems mad that Poirot isn't actually leaving the train at Belgrade, just moving into a new compartment in the same car. We have a very good section here of Poirot observing his fellow passengers as he's wont to do. I love when Christie and others writers do scenes like this where it's all just character work at play. He observes this really obnoxious American woman who doesn't shut up about her daughter and makes offensive comments about non Americans. He notices Colonel Arbuthnot is still mooning around Mary Debenham. We don't get a name at this time for a lot of these people, but we know there's like a swarthy Italian, an ugly Russian princess, a married couple, some other people. The train arrives at the station in Belgrade, and Poirot notes it's gotten a lot colder and the snow is heavier. He moves to compartment number one now that Book has moved into the Athens car, which is also empty except for one Greek doctor, whom we'll meet later. Next morning, everybody leaves the breakfast car except for Poirot and Ratchet. Ratchet is that older American man he met at the hotel. Ratchet wants to hire Poirot for protection as he has an enemy or enemies. He offers Poirot $20,000, which is about $471,000 in today's money. But Poirot rejects his offer because he doesn't like Ratchet's face. That line to me is one of the most iconic lines in a Christie novel. I don't like your face, Poirot says. Brutal. I wish I could say that to people in my life. But Ratchet brushes off Poirot and shows him a gun he carries with him. McQueen is shocked to learn Poirot is still on the train, having believed he left at Belgrade, even though Poirot said he was not leaving at Belgrade. The night is pretty rough ride here. Poirot formally meets Mrs. Hubbard, that would be the obnoxious American woman who can't stop talking. Poirot and Mrs. Hubbard have the compartments on either side of Ratchet. Mrs. Hubbard hates Ratchet and believes he's a train robber who's going to hold them all up and that he's definitely evil. Poirot has a restless night. He's woken up by a lot of commotion going on in Ratchet's compartment next door. A lot of bells are ringing for the attendant. Ratchet apparently called for the attendant. When he arrives, he says, quote, "Ce n'est rien, je me suis trompé," which is French for "it's nothing, I have made a mistake." Mrs. Hubbard also rings for the attendant, insisting a man is in her compartment, but obviously no one is there, and there's no place for a man to hide. Poirot rings for the attendant himself and asks for mineral water. The attendant tells him what's been happening and that the train is stopped, not at a station, but in the snow. It's stuck between Vinkovci and Broad. Poirot goes back to sleep, but he's once again awakened by banging. This time it's at his door, but no one is there except for a woman in a red kimono running away from the cabin. The next day, Poirot goes to breakfast, and everyone is talking about the train being stuck in the snow and how inconvenient that is. Poirot notices that Mary Debenham, who was so worried about making this train in the first place, isn't at all concerned now that the train is stopped and she's going to be late for wherever she was going. Book summons Poirot, and we learn that Ratchet is dead. He was stabbed multiple times in the chest. Dr. Constantine, that's the Greek doctor from the other car, examined the body, and there's a lot of weird things going on with it. Ratchet was stabbed about 12 times. Constantine can't be sure because the blows vary in depth, and some of them are merely scratches, but he estimates the number is 12. Some were delivered with great strength, and others barely penetrated the body. Some were delivered by a right handed person, others by a left handed person. The estimated time of death is 1 a.m. At 20 to 1 is when Poirot heard all that noise in Ratchet's cabin and heard him speak to the conductor through the door. The conductor's name is Pierre Michel. It's clear the murderer has to be someone in the Calais coach. The window in Ratchet's cabin was open, but the train was stopped, and there are no footprints in the snow. The theory that someone murdered Ratchet and departed the train just doesn't cut it. Book asks Poirot to investigate, to which he agrees. He begins by questioning Hector McQueen, who is Ratchet's secretary. McQueen didn't really like Ratchet, but there wasn't any real problems between them. McQueen did know about the threatening letters Ratchet received, but he didn't know Ratchet appealed to Poirot for help. He actually thought Poirot was a dressmaker, which is really funny. Usually different from the hairdresser Poirot gets mistaken for. McQueen presents Poirot with those threatening letters, and Poirot notices that one of the letters was written by multiple people, as if they alternated writing individual letter characters. Poirot is also disappointed at how uncreative the letters are, but McQueen doesn't otherwise provide any useful information. Poirot examines Ratchet's cabin, and there are quite a few interesting things here. One of them is that the light switch was off, and he develops a theory that one person came in, stabbed Ratchet, turned the lights off, and then left. Then, later on, a second person came and stabbed Ratchet again, not realizing he was already dead. Ratchet had a gun nearby, but he never used it, and he appears to have been drugged. A woman's handkerchief with the initial H and a man's pipe cleaner are found on the floor. This strikes Poirot immediately as someone deliberately leaving those items behind to incriminate other people. The connecting door between Ratchet's room and Mrs. Hubbard's is locked, and it's locked on Mrs. Hubbard's end. Ratchet had a pocket watch which was struck by a knife blow and stopped at 1:15 in the morning. There are charred bits of paper on a nightstand. Poirot goes full on MacGyver here and uses a lady's hat box to create this contraption so he can read those charred letters, and he makes out the words, "Member Little Daisy Armstrong." There are a lot of physical clues in this book. This might actually be the novel with the most physical clues in it. Poirot immediately, upon reading those words, recognizes Ratchet as Cassetti, who is somehow connected to the Daisy Armstrong kidnapping. Daisy Armstrong was a 3-year-old American girl who was kidnapped and murdered by Cassetti, who was part of some kind of criminal gang that specialized in kidnappings. The Armstrong family paid the ransom, but Daisy was already dead. Cassetti was charged with the crime, but he got off on a technicality after he intimidated, bribed, and used his influence over the powers that be. As a result of this tragic situation, Daisy's mother, Sonia Armstrong, went into premature labor, and both she and her baby died. Daisy's father, Colonel Armstrong, committed suicide in grief. A nursemaid also committed suicide as she fell under suspicion, even though she was completely innocent. Her name was Suzanne. And this backstory is a very obvious reference to the infamous Lindbergh baby kidnapping, which was, as of the publication of this novel, still open and debatably still is open and unsolved. This was something that was very much on the minds of everyone around the world at this time. And Cassetti is Ratchet, and Poirot wonders if there's any living members of the Armstrong family who would want to seek revenge. Sonia Armstrong is known to have had a younger sister, and her mother was an actress. Having viewed the crime scene and the body, Poirot is ready to interview the passengers. This is a very long series of interviews, and I have been open over how much I do not like long series of interrogations where the detective speaks to each suspect for chapter after chapter. They're really dull and stagnant. I won't say this series of interviews is dull and stagnant, but, this is a long novel, and it feels long in this section. I do this middle portion hampers the novel quite a bit here. This is probably my biggest knock against it. I know people are upset I did not have this book higher in my Poirot rankings. I had it at number 8, which is still high. I still think that's top tier. But, it could have been number 1 had this formatting been different, but more on that later on. The first interview is with Pierre Michel, the conductor. Book and Constantine are also sitting in on these interrogations. And I will say, just as a broad note for these interviews, everybody's testimony corroborates with other people's evidence. I don't want to go through all of these in painstaking detail. I'm just going to pull the highlights from each person. All of Michel's evidence matches up with what Poirot already knows. He did leave his spot at the end of the train car momentarily to visit the conductor in the Athens coach, but he's sure no one entered Ratchet's compartment, and no one could have snuck on the train at the last station either, because he would have noticed. Michel attended to several passengers' bells, including Poirot and Mrs. Hubbard. Princess Dragomirov, she's the ugly old Russian princess, rang for her maid Hildegard Schmidt. McQueen and Masterman, that's Ratchet's secretary and valet, did visit their boss, but that was much earlier in the evening. McQueen and Colonel Arbuthnot were in McQueen's cabin until past 2 a.m. He did not see the woman in... Oh, I'm sorry, he did see the woman in the red kimono, but she just went to the bathroom, and she didn't bang on Poirot's door like the detective thought she did. Hector McQueen is up next. He didn't really like his boss, and isn't that surprised at all that he turned out to be Cassetti. McQueen is talking to Arbuthnot until 2 a.m. in the morning in McQueen's cabin. He didn't see anything, Somehow, absolutely incredibly, McQueen says his father was the district attorney who worked on the Daisy Armstrong case, so he was familiar with Ratchet. Poirot and company take this revelation so nonchalantly it boggles the mind, and McQueen does not smoke a pipe. Next up is Edward Masterman. He's Ratchet's British valet. He too shows no signs of remorse for his employer's death after learning about his boss's true identity. He also doesn't smoke a pipe, and he doesn't really provide information like at all. He shares his cabin with the quote large swarthy Italian unquote, and neither left their cabin. We'll get to him. Masterman last saw his employer much earlier the previous evening and had a toothache all night. He does not smoke a pipe, nor does he know anyone in the Armstrong family. After him, we have Caroline Hubbard. She's the talkative American who can't shut up about her daughter. She insists there was a man in her cabin, but when Pierre Michel attended to her, he searched the compartment and there was no man there, nor was there any place for him to be hiding. But Mrs. Hubbard insists there was a man there. And when asked, she says the connecting door between her compartment and Ratchet's was locked when she went to bed. She knows this because she asked the Swedish lady to check because Mrs. Hubbard couldn't see the lock from where she was sitting because her sponge bag was in the way. And the Swedish lady said it was locked. She does not own a scarlet kimono, nor is the H handkerchief hers. She's glad Ratchet's dead because she knew he was evil, and she takes great pride in snuffing him out correctly here. And she then reveals that she has proof of a man in her cabin because she found a button that is not hers, and that button belongs to a Wagonly conductor uniform. Poirot asks if this came from Pierre Michel's uniform from when he went in her cabin, but his buttons are all intact, so are the buttons of the other conductors' uniforms. Mrs. Hubbard doesn't have any clue how the man got in her cabin in the first place, or how he left, because she was so afraid her eyes were closed the whole time. I never really thought of Murder on the Orient Express this way, but this is technically a locked room mystery here. And I should note that when Poirot examined the crime scene, the connecting door was unlocked, and it only locks and unlocks from Mrs. Hubbard's side of the door. Greta Olson is up next. She's the Swedish lady. She's actually a nurse traveling back home to her sister's house. This interview is the reader's introduction to Greta Olson. She does not get mentioned before this that much. This is really the first time we meet her, and it's roughly halfway through the book at this point, which is really not great. And it also happens actually much worse with other characters. Because this book is so good and such a classic, I'm not really holding it against it, but it's another little blip here on why I don't think this is Christie's best novel ever. But Greta Olson shares her compartment with Mary Debenham, and neither of them left their cabin either. Although earlier in the night, Greta did visit Mrs. Hubbard and ask for an aspirin, and she accidentally opened Ratchet's door. She says she was angry. He was angry and mad, but she interrupted his reading. And she does not own a scarlet kimono or the handkerchief. She never even heard of the Daisy Armstrong kidnapping. Everyone else at least heard of it. It's basically the Lindbergh baby crime of the century. Princess Natalia Dragomurov is next. She's the old Russian princess. Everyone keeps commenting on how ugly she is. She's very old, and despite her position, very compliant. She doesn't provide much information regarding Cassetti or Ratchet, but she does know the Armstrong family. She's actually Sonia Armstrong's godmother. And this news is also taken not at all shockingly by Poirot and friends. How they don't find this curious is another little flaw in this book, and one I actually do hold against it. She provides some information about the living Armstrong members. Sonia's mother, that would be Daisy's grandmother, is named Linda Arden. She's an old friend of the princesses, and Linda Arden is still alive. She was a famous actress, but she lives in seclusion since the tragedy. Sonia also had a younger sister, but the princess doesn't know where she is, since she's not really in contact with the younger generation. She does not own a scarlet kimono either, and Poirot does not ask her about the handkerchief since her initials don't include the letter H. Poirot speaks next with Count Rudolf Andreni. He's a Hungarian diplomat who was once stationed in Washington, D.C., but he didn't know the Armstrongs as far as he's aware. He also doesn't smoke a pipe. He seems very protective of his wife Elena, the Countess Andreni, but is otherwise compliant. He does seem to resent like all of this questioning, but he doesn't really provide a lot of information. His wife does not own a scarlet kimono, but very curiously, her passport has a spot of grease over her name, although she confirms her name is Elena Andreni, née Goldstein. She takes a sleeping medication, so she was out all night. Colonel Arbuthnot is up next. He doesn't think he knows the Armstrongs, but he does know a lot of people named Armstrong and rambles on about them in the way his these former military men tend to do in Christie. He does smoke a pipe, and he thinks he may have seen a woman pass by McQueen's cabin around the time of the murder, but he wasn't really paying attention to her or the time or anything like that. He was in McQueen's cabin until past 2, which is after the murder happened. Poirot keeps asking Arbuthnot about Mary Debenham, which does nothing but anger Arbuthnot for seemingly no reason. He insists Mary had nothing to do with anything. Cyrus Hardman is the next person Poirot interrogates. I don't even think Hardman was mentioned prior to this interview. He's a typewriter ribbon salesman, which really dates this novel. He's an American from New York City and pretty quickly gives up the typewriter ribbon salesman act and reveals he's actually a private detective from New York. Hardman is extremely forgettable as a character, but I always remember his dialogue because he speaks like you force like Chat GPT to write dialogue for Sam Spade. It's almost cartoony the way Hardman talks, like a stereotypical American hard-boiled detective. Ratchet hired Hardman to keep a watch on him after he received a few threatening letters. Ratchet wasn't very forward or open about his potential enemies, but he mentioned a short, dark man with a womanish voice, which is a description that fits absolutely no one on the Orient Express, and Hardman does not smoke a pipe. Poirot finally gets to interview Antonio Foscarelli, the Italian, and Mr. Book was constantly of this opinion that the murderer must be the Italian because Italians are very violent and stab people. This is apparently a trait they all have in common, but Poirot just kept brushing Book off, and he wanted to, play into his class snobbishness and interview the first class passengers first. And now he's finally on to the second class passengers. And Foscarelli, gives this like odd, Italian American stereotypical depiction, almost gangster like. Book speculates he probably wasn't Cassetti's gang. Poirot just brushes this all off again. It's very clearly a one sided rivalry between Book and Foscarelli. Foscarelli does not smoke a pipe, nor does he know the Armstrongs, but he does know a lot about cars because he sells Fords in the United States, and boy, he doesn't stop talking about cars. He talks about cars as often as Mrs. Hubbard talks about her daughter. Mary Debenham is up next. Poirot is less kind to her, as he was with everyone else. She doesn't own a scarlet kimono, but when asked, she said that one isn't hers, which is a very strange way of saying that. Poirot pounces on this, and she explained that, yeah, she actually did see that woman in the kimono, and it had dragons on it. She peeked out her cabin door, but, she didn't get a good look at the woman, but the woman was very tall. And he asked her a lot about Colonel Arbuthnot, but Mary just says Poirot is asking too personal questions, and she doesn't answer. After she leaves, Poirot tells Book and Constantine that he actually does suspect Mary Debenham because she's cold, and this was a premeditated murder, and also he overheard something that incriminates her. The other two men, however, are just totally smitten with Mary, and they refuse to believe she's a murderer. They're in love with her. The implication Poirot is making here is that Mary Debenham and Colonel Arbuthnot are in this together, but the problem is those two are alibied by other people when you would expect they would alibi each other if they were conspirators, so that's a bit of an obstacle here. Finally, the final person to be interviewed is Hildegard Schmidt. She is a German lady's maid to Princess Dragomirov. She doesn't own a scarlet kimono, and the handkerchief isn't hers. And she was all over the place on the evening of the murder. Her employer kept calling for her and wanting things. She was in and out of the princess's compartment. She didn't see anyone go into Ratchet's cabin, but she did bump into a conductor. But this conductor wasn't Pierre Michel. Hildegard Schmidt describes him as a short, dark man with a womanish voice, and he is not any of the conductors that are currently on the train, either in the Calais coach or in the other coaches. She also didn't know the Armstrongs, but she did hear of the Daisy kidnapping. And that concludes the interviews. Poirot and Book and Constantine discuss what they learned, which isn't really a lot. I mean, the whole case is in chaos. There's one murderer, there's two murderers, a man, a woman. Everyone's testimony more or less lined up with the others. There's no explanation for the woman in the kimono, like where this short, dark man with the womanly voice went. Poirot speculates the man might have actually been a woman because he couldn't have left the train, and he can't be hiding, and he doesn't resemble any of the men in the Calais coach. There's too much chaos, too much unanswered questions, too many impossibilities. It's all a mess. And it gets worse because Mrs. Hubbard starts screaming like a lunatic as she puts on a very over dramatic performance here. Everyone kind of knows she's just like being ridiculous, but they just let her go on because it's Mrs. Hubbard. It's what she does. But she found a bloody knife in her sponge bag, and this is the murder weapon. And while Book and Constantine think this is progress, Poirot does not view it as such, because Ratchet was stabbed by more than one person, and this knife delivered all of the wounds. So, two murderers used the same weapon at different times. Like, that doesn't make much sense there. And Mrs. Hubbard faints, and when she wakes up, she demands a new cabin, which she receives. She actually goes to an entirely different train car. There, she helps Poirot with an experiment. Poirot tries to lock on the room's connecting door because Mrs. Hubbard claimed she couldn't see the lock the evening of the murder and asked Greta Olson to see if it was locked, to which Greta Olson said it was. But the door was obviously unlocked at some point if people passed through it, which appears to have been happened. Poirot confirms Mrs. Hubbard could not have seen the lock because the sponge bag was in the way, and speculates that maybe Greta Olson was lying about the door being locked or was simply mistaken. Poirot, Book, and Constantine undertake a search of everyone's luggage. Matching pipe cleaners to the one found in the crime scene are in Arbuthnot's luggage. That's not a surprise, and Poirot and Book later speculate the pipe cleaner was obviously planted there by someone, whereas the handkerchief was left by accident. The luggage tag on Countess Andreni's luggage is wet. The Wagonly conductor uniform with the missing button is found in Hildegard Schmidt's luggage. She's shocked and denies any allegation. Poirot assures her she's all right. He had already speculated that if Hildegard Schmidt was innocent, the uniform would be found in her luggage, but it does not necessarily prove her innocence. Poirot asks a few people some really nosy questions. He asks Princess Dragomirov why she has a German lady's maid instead of a French one like all rich women have. And throughout this novel, Poirot makes quite a few leaps in deduction that I don't think always make much sense. And yeah, like some of them are, stem from classism, but there are some that just like don't make any sense at all. Poirot is very harsh toward Mary Debenham once again. He demands to know like what she meant when she told Colonel Arbuthnot when it was all over. She tells him to mind his own damn business and it had nothing to do with the murder. Poirot notes that her and Arbuthnot seem very close, even though both of them are rather cold personality wise. They just met and they're British, and the British don't do things like this. He also asks her why she's not worried about being late now, to which she doesn't give any real answer. She says something about how she was in a hurry to get on the Orient Express because she was meeting friends and she couldn't be late. But Poirot counters and says, well, if she did miss the Orient Express, she could have caught the train the next day and telegrammed her friends to let them know of the delay. Now she's stuck in the snow for who knows how long. There's no telegrams, she can't contact her friends, and she's perfectly fine. Poirot does not find the scarlet kimono in any of the passengers' luggage, and that's because it's in his. And this really is a huge clue. I'll explain why later, but Poirot is incensed by this. How dare the killer use his luggage as a dumping ground for evidence? He finds this very personal now. Book and Constantine claim they don't really like learn anything, and they have no idea what's going on or what to do next. They're Book and Constantine here are definitely much the like subpar, generic police officers you would see in most Christie novels. Poirot says that although they don't have any answers, they have learned a lot, or at least he has. Book and Constantine are the greatest, or not the greatest, or wisest sidekicks here. Poirot specifically points out that Hector McQueen said he got the job as Ratchet's secretary mainly for his language speaking abilities because Ratchet only spoke English. Yet, 20 minutes before 1, someone was speaking French in Ratchet's cabin. This theoretically places the murder as happening earlier than believed. And the three of them go through this like long series of pondering different scenarios and attempting to answer all kinds of questions, like creating theory after theory. It's not really worth getting into because it's all speculation and mostly winds up not mattering at all in the end anyway. Poirot is particularly focused on a few things. One, he's very convinced the pipe cleaner and the handkerchief with the H are planted evidence. As he reasons, the murderer must have planned this crime perfectly, but didn't count on the train being stopped. So that threw things off. And the murderer couldn't have make it look like he left the train at the next stop after Vinkovci because that stop still hasn't been reached. So all of this about the pipe cleaner and the handkerchief are improvised last minute clues. Poirot reasons that a murder planned this well was not perpetrated by someone who would carelessly leave behind such obvious evidence. And the other thing he's focused on is that grease spot on the Countess Indreni's passport. The grease spot partially obscures her first name, and combining that with her wet luggage tag, Poirot suspects that Countess Andreni's Christian name isn't Elena, but Helena with an H. And not only that, but he says he thinks Countess Andreni is Sonia Armstrong's sister because their mother was Linda Arden, the famous actress. And Linda Arden is a stage name. Her real name is not known, but she could have been Central European Jewish because why not? I mean, she could have been anything, honestly. So I'm not really sure, like, that leap in luggage there, a logic there. But the point is that Linda Arden's real name could have been Goldstein, which is similar to Countess Andreni's said her mother's maiden name was. This is definitely like a very weak point in the novel. Poirot makes a lot of assumptions that I just don't think are valid. And yeah, I know they're stuck in the middle of nowhere and they can't verify information. So Poirot is basically guessing, but there's a lot of wild assumptions he makes out of nowhere, including this one. But Book points out that Princess Dragomirov said she didn't know where Linda Arden's other daughter was, and Poirot's just like, well, yeah, she lied. Like, of course she knew who Countess Indreni was, and lied to shield her identity. And she also lied about Linda Arden's daughter marrying an American when she was really married to a Hungarian. And, like, it never occurred to Book here that someone would be lying, which is just insane. But this is all a really roundabout way of Poirot getting to the point that the handkerchief is probably Countess Andreni's, and the couple was lying about it. But when the Andrenis called in for another interview, the Countess says that's still not her handkerchief. But yes, her real name is Helena, not Elena. And yes, she is Sonia Armstrong's sister. But she says she didn't murder Cassetti. She was asleep all night. And her husband also insists this is true and swears on his honor the Countess never left her cabin. Poirot asks the Countess if she recognizes anybody else on the train, and she says no. He then asks her, well, what about Princess Dragomirov? Like, she had to recognize her. And the Countess says, oh, yeah, she did recognize her. But Poirot asks her a lot of odd questions about, like, what her governess was like as a child, and she said her name was Miss Freebody, and she was a big Scottish lady with red hair. Essentially, what the Andrenis were doing was that they heard the victim was Cassetti, so they hastily tried to hide Helena's identity because she has a connection to the Armstrongs, and that made her an obvious suspect. So they put the grease on her passport and damaged the luggage tag. Princess Dragomirov meets with Poirot again, and she admits, yeah, she did know who Countess Indreni was, and she lied about it. Oh, and that handkerchief with the H on it, that's hers, because her first name is Natalia, but in Russian, it's written with the Russian letters, the N looks like an H. Poirot once again reassesses and recaps all of this information he collected, and discusses what it could all mean, and he finally comes to a conclusion. He calls in Colonel Arbuthnot and asks him about his conversation with Mary Debenham and what it meant, the one where Arbuthnot said, when it's all over. He refuses to answer, and Poirot gets very testy with him and accuses the colonel of lying about his relationship with Mary because on the Tourist Express, Poirot heard the colonel call Miss Debenham Mary, which a British man like Arbuthnot would not do unless he was familiar with the woman. Poirot then accuses both Arbuthnot and Mary of being connected to the Armstrongs. Arbuthnot admits he served with John Armstrong, that's Daisy's father, in the war. Mary also admits to being Sonia Armstrong's secretary and Helena's governess, which I always found very odd because Mary is only like a couple of years older than Helena. I was sort of on the impression they're like basically the same age. Poirot figured this out because this is another really weird here. The Countess said her governess's name was Miss Freebody, and there was once a store in London named Debenham and Freebody, which to an American reader is a clue lost, I'm sure, and maybe even to the present day British readers, this clue is lost here. Poirot then goes in pretty quick succession through most of the other passengers. Masterman was John Armstrong's Batman during the war, and when I say war, I mean World War One. Foscarelli was the chauffeur in the Armstrong house. That deduction I think makes sense because he now sells cars, Fords, don't forget. Hildegard Schmidt was the Armstrong family cook, as Poirot surmised somehow she was a good cook previously. The only passengers he can't connect are Mrs. Hubbard and Greta Olson, although he does suspect they were the Armstrong family maid and nurse to Daisy, respectively, as well as Cyrus Hardman. So lots of connections to the Armstrongs are suddenly aboard the Orient Express, but nothing tells us what actually happened to Cassetti slash Ratchet as of yet. So this is where I end the spoiler-free summary. Back out now if you don't want to be spoiled, although I imagine very few people watching this video haven't read this book, but I'll be cautious and warn you anyway. Poirot gathers everyone in the dining car for a summation gathering. Poirot says he has two explanations about what happened to Cassetti. He will present both of these and let the companions, Book and Dr. Constantine, decide which is the correct answer. The first explanation is that a mobster enemy of Ratchet boarded the train at one of the previous stations unseen by any conductor. This is the short, dark man with the womanish voice. He previously secured a Wagon Lee conductor uniform so he could move about the train unsuspected. He was seen by several people, including McQueen and Hildegard Schmidt. He entered Mrs. Hubbard's cabin, used the connecting door to enter Ratchet's cabin, where he stabbed him, and deposited the bloody knife in Mrs. Hubbard's sponge bag when he departed. He then stripped off the uniform and put in Hildegard Schmidt's luggage because he knew she was not in her cabin before leaving the train at the same station he boarded. This doesn't really match like the time of death via the broken watch, but as Poirot explains, Ratchet failed to realize the train had entered a new time zone. The passengers agree this all makes sense, but Dr. Constantine says that doesn't really match the medical evidence, while Book says there's a lot of other pieces that just like don't fit in. It works somewhat, but doesn't answer a lot of things. So Poirot proposes his second suggestion. All of the passengers are in on it. Everyone in the Calais coach, except for Poirot and Book, are part of a conspiracy to deliver justice to Cassetti because he had escaped justice in America. Everyone played their part and provided alibis for one another. Since everyone is connected to the Armstrongs in some way, it stands to reason they're all in on it. This many people could not be on the Orient Express at the same time during the off season by sheer coincidence. As Poirot explains, such a motley grouping of different nationalities could only happen in America, where Daisy Armstrong was from. The depiction of the U.S. in this book is, very wrong. It's very Eagle Land stereotype. I'll get there. Poirot accuses Hardman of being in love with Suzanne, the French nanny, who committed suicide after she was wrongly suspected of being involved. He says Hardman seems like the kind of man who likes French women, whatever that means. And the passengers very quickly admit that this suggestion is correct. They wanted justice for Daisy and her parents and Suzanne after Cassetti fled. Because Hardman really is a private detective, he was able to track Cassetti down in Europe, where McQueen and Masterman were able to gain employment as step one in this plan. Because Cassetti Ratchet traveled a lot, it was only a matter of time before he traveled on the Orient Express. And when that day came, these 12 people considered themselves a jury gathered on the Orient Express Calais coach to carry out their plan. They could not book every cabin in the Calais coach because Book has a special cabin that cannot be booked, but they booked all the other cabins, including the one under the fake name of Mr. Harris. The first wrench in their plan was Poirot's sudden arrival when Book forced Poirot into the berth booked for Mr. Harris and then later moved him into Book's private cabin. Because of Poirot's sudden arrival, plans had to be amended. There was now a stranger on the train who was not part of the plan and had to be handled somehow. It's not clear what was part of the original plan and what was the quick adaptation for Poirot, but things like the woman in the scarlet kimono and the man speaking French in Ratchet's cabin and the handkerchief and the pipe cleaners were all meaningless clues. This is the too many clues. When things are overly complicated and there's a lot of evidence, you should just ignore it. These were all things meant to distract and divert. Throughout the night, each individual entered Mrs. Hubbard's cabin and then went through the connecting door to stab Ratchet. This is why the stab wounds look like they were made by different culprits, because they were. The passengers really did perform the actions they said they did. That way, their stories could sync up and be true. But there are still clues indicating them. First of all, Ratchet took a sleeping medication, which he would not have done because he was on alert for a threat. He never would have done that. Second, McQueen almost said that the Daisy Armstrong note should have been burnt, and he wouldn't have been able to know that unless he was involved. And all of this means that Mrs. Hubbard also has to have a connection to the Armstrongs. And she's Linda Arden, the famous actress, and Sonia Armstrong's mother. As an actress, she could play the role of this obnoxious woman screaming about a man in her cabin and putting up all these acts wonderfully. But there's an issue. There are 12 stab wounds in Cassetti, but Poirot is confident Countess Andreni took no part in that. So someone else has to be involved, and that someone is Pierre Michel, who is Suzanne's father. As the conductor, he had full control over the Calais coach, and he very obviously would have seen something. And the Calais coach was chosen specifically because Pierre Michel is the conductor of it. That's also another unspoken clue here. When Poirot and Book and Constantine are conducting the interviews, Pierre Michel is supposed to be watching the passengers so they don't tamper with anything, but he's in on it, so there's no one watching them. So they're free to tamper with things as they please. This is when the kimono had to be placed in Poirot's luggage, for instance. And what really put Poirot onto them was the line Mrs. Hubbard told. She said that she asked Greta Olson to check if the connecting door lock was secure because she couldn't see it because her sponge bag was in the way. Greta Olson said it was locked. However, in Mrs. Hubbard's cabin, her original cabin, the lock is above the handle, not below it, like it is in the even number cabins. Their plan further went awry when the train became stopped in the snow. Because the intention was to frame the small man with the womanish voice, but the train was stuck, it meant that that man had no way of escaping the train in the night. Linda Arden begs Poirot to let the others go because they all have futures. Arbuthnot and Mary are going to get married, and, like Foscarelli has a career, and these other people, they're young, and they have futures. Well, her life is over. I mean, she's old, all of her family is dead. Let her take the blame. So Poirot asks Book and Constantine which of the suggestions they think is correct. Constantine says he may have made some errors in the medical report, while Book also agrees with that and says the first solution is the correct one. Poirot says, very well, they will tell the Yugoslav police it was the short man with the womanish voice, and he retires from the case. His job is done. He investigated. He provided his client, Book, with the possible solutions, and it's out of his hand. It's not lost on me that this book ends with another jury, this one a two-man jury of Book and Constantine, delivering a technically incorrect verdict, just like the Cassetti jury did. The end. Let's get into praise. This book is one of the most famous novels of all time, and that's no small praise. Murder on the Orient Express isn't the book that made Christie famous, but I think it's the book that keeps her famous. If you asked anyone on the street to name a Christie novel, I would bet Murder on the Orient Express is the most common answer you would receive. Its enduring legacy is a testament to how much this book resonates with readers. And I would imagine probably today, since reading is down, a lot of people are just more familiar with the films, and that's fine, as long as it's not the Kenneth Branagh version. But still, this is still the best Kenneth Branagh film, at least there's that. It's not unique among Christie in this aspect, but this is one of those Christie novels that's not really about the mystery. The mystery is almost secondary to the larger story of justice. And I think people love the idea of seeing this group of people, all very different people, come together to achieve justice. They've corrected the wrong done to them and their loved ones. And I think many people would love to achieve that justice as well. And not necessarily murder anyone, but there is something very satisfying about seeing a horrible person finally get what's coming to them. Ratchet slash Cassetti, more than any other Christie victim, is the jerk victim. And this book does that so dramatically. It has staying power. I talk a lot about how other books like Five Little Pigs and Sat Cypress and The Hollow are really not about the murder. The story is about the characters, and there's a murder in there. But unlike those books, Christie tries and succeeds to have it both ways with Murder on the Orient Express in a way she does in no other book, maybe, and then there were none. In the likes of Five Little Pigs, the murder plot is thin. She did not spend a lot of time plotting out the mechanics. But in this book, she does. She gives equal weight to the murder plot and that other storyline. She's doing both things at once here, and she pulls them off spectacularly. And I think that's part of the reason why this book endures so much. It has the storyline, but it also has the fun and exciting mystery plot. Everyone did it. And if you read closely, it's actually pretty obvious everyone did it. Once more than one person connected to Daisy is on the train. That should have been your red flag there. But because everyone did it, it seems impossible. Surely not everyone did it. And the clues are there for the most part. And just because none of the clues, the physical clues and events, I mean, they mean much, it doesn't mean Christie could just haphazardly throw in a bunch of meaningless items and be done with it. It still required so much planning and intricacy because everyone's stories do line up. Everyone really did the events they said they did. And you can picture Christie plotting all of this out and having all these people in place like a stage director and telling them where to go and see where they went and see if anything clashed or was impossible. This is the best example of the too many clues clue. And Chrissy traveled on the Orient Express several times in her life. She knew the train. She knew the mechanics of it. And this is not even the first story she wrote about the Orient Express. The Parker Pine story, Have You Got Everything You Want, was. But she knew everything about this train, and to depict it succinctly and accurately without going into long winded descriptions, I felt like I knew what the train looked like and what the operations were without seeing it. I also felt the cold stillness once the train stopped. It's so well done. This book is a masterpiece. I don't just call anything a masterpiece. I think if you're a longtime listener and viewer of this channel, I'm perhaps overly critical of a lot of things. I don't just willy nilly give praise when it's unfounded. And this is an honor calling it a masterpiece. I reserve for very few books. And I could just go on and on and on about how good this book is, despite my past criticism and future criticism I have of it. But I think just saying this book is a masterpiece, I think that says it all. Now, this book is not perfect. I maintain my criticisms of it are valid. I think these criticisms hold less water with me than they used to. I am more willing to overlook things in this book than I am with others. I am not a fan of the long series of interviews with each suspect one after another. The style gets very dull, and quite frankly, it's just not that interesting, especially since very little of what is learned there is relevant to solving the murder, and it's also a lot of repetition. Now, I'm more forgiving of this issue in Murder on the Orient Express because they're stuck on a train. There's nothing else to be done. And also, just the format of this novel, I think, is like leave no other options here. There are a lot of clues in this novel, and I said most of them are good, but some are not. I mean, the Debenham and Free Body, I think, is one that's lost saliency nowadays, as that store does not exist anymore. I mean, granted, neither does the Orient Express, but the store apparently wasn't even in operation by the time this novel was published. Poirot said there used to be a store, Debenham and Free Body, and it's a real store. I looked it up. The clue of the lock on the connecting doors being in different places, depending on the cabin number, is not something we know ahead of time. I think this is an instance of Christie knowing her stuff too well that she assumed people would know that. I don't travel on trains much, and certainly not on luxury overnight passenger trains, so I have no knowledge of this. The murder plot itself is very good. It's the type of murder plot that people who aren't criminals but read murder mysteries would come up with, in the sense that it's overly complicated and goes wrong. Think like Death on the Nile is a similar book where this happens. This plot has holes in it, and I'm not judging those holes. Christie intentionally put those holes there so things could go wrong, but there are one or two I think are accidental. We're led to believe that some of the issues popped up because Poirot was unexpectedly on the train, but if Poirot had not been on the train in the Calais coach, then Monsieur Book would have been in that cabin. So they still would have needed something, and they should have known that because Pierre Michel should have known Book would be there. I also think a much easier plan would have just simply have been to throw Ratchet's dead body out of the moving train. I mean, granted, this couldn't happen because the train stopped, but that really would have been a better plan than to risk incriminating themselves. I also think certain people there really shouldn't have been. Assuming a plan made where the train was not expected to stop, Countess Andreni and Princess Dragomirov are publicly known figures with prominent and known connections to the Armstrongs. I mean, Linda Arden risks being recognized, though she's in costume, and McQueen is not traveling under an assumed name, which I think is really dumb. How on earth Ratchet hired him is unbelievable to me. He has the same last name as the attorney who prosecuted him. These are all a little unbelievable. I mean, some of the individual characters are duds. I just covered The Finishing Stroke, which also had a group of 12 characters stuck in the snow, and only one or two of them were duds, and not even that bad. I mean, this book has a few. Hildegard Schmidt, Masterman, Hardman, all duds, all completely forgettable. Every time I read this book, I forget Hardman is even there. Like, I always try to count, like, who are the 12? I always come up with 11, so I forget about Hardman. And even the more prominent ones, like Hector McQueen, are not that notable. And I think the biggest criticism for me that sticks is the depiction of America and Americans. It's hard for me to assess this because I am an American, but there's this like stereotype non-Americans have of the country. Here in the US, we call it Eagle Land, where others look at us, especially in 1934 as this like land of the free where everyone is equal because we don't have aristocrats and royalty and all these other social structures the UK has. But that's just not true. It's not true today, and it wasn't true in 1934. I find it extremely difficult to believe these 12 people, really 13, could work together on this plot. Now, they are bound by extraordinary circumstances, which is a factor keeping them together, but there's still a social hierarchy. And we're told, like, Linda Arden is the one who came up with the idea, and, like, why would she consult, like, the chauffeur? A Russian princess is not on equal footing to an Italian chauffeur or her own lady's maid, her own servant. Now, Christie depicts the United States as if the idea of America is a reality. She also does insert British societal norms into American societal norms. At one point, Poirot speculates Count Indreni, who spent a lot of time in Washington, would know the New York based Armstrongs because they're from the same class. That's not really how it works in the US. Christie also depicts servants as dedicated to the family they serve, which is a very British thing. I'm not so certain how devoted some of these servants would have been to the Armstrongs. Again, a tragedy did befall them, and I think that does a lot of the work keeping them together. But I think the deduction American servants have is the dedication American servants have is far less than what is depicted here. And there's some minor, not great moments here, mostly against Foscarelli being Italian, and how he's the one who came up with the idea to stab Ratchet because that's all Italians do is stab people. We see this a lot in Christie, who brings up Italians and Spaniards as violent quite a bit. Cassetti being Italian, also not that great. A lot of unsavory, like mafia depictions of Italians once more. And I'm not going to bring it back up here again, but I mentioned previously Poirot makes a lot of just really strange deductions that don't make sense. The content is not there for that. But again, already talked about it, not going to bring it up again. Let's move on to characters, starting with Poirot. And I've always found it very interesting. Christie put Poirot in this novel. I know this is in 1934, and this is the height of Poirot's career, where the public just kept demanding Poirot, Poirot, Poirot. Christie was getting sick of him as she wanted to do more marbles and more standalones, and she liked short stories. And typically, Christie's biggest concept novels are standalones, and then there were none. Ordeal by Innocence, Towards Zero. The reason is because she wanted those concepts and the story to shine, and Poirot was the star, and he detracted from that. But she did occasionally put Poirot in her bigger concept novels as well. Five Little Pigs, Sad Cypress, and in those big concepts, Poirot is subdued. He's not like the funny foreigner or even the star of the show. And she does this because Poirot is familiar to readers, so he doesn't need an introduction. She can get immediately going on what she wants to do. And I think Poirot is fine here. There were actually a lot more like Poirot-isms than I had remembered, but I do feel as if Poirot is a bit subdued here, which is fine. He doesn't need to be like Poirot-y. This is a very serious novel, and it's not meant to be entertaining as a more generic puzzle mystery. I think there are many times when Poirot jumps to conclusions and makes some pretty big leaps in logic that are uncharacteristic of him. Now, he does have his clash snobbishness here, which does explain some of that. But I do think this is one of his greatest cases, one of his hardest to solve, because he has no outside sources, and the mystery has a high degree of difficulty, and he willingly accepts the outcome Book and Constantine suggest, which I think is very fitting. I know a lot of the adaptations really make a big moral conflict for Poirot here, but the book treats it as a matter of simple routine, which is closer to Poirot. Poirot has no problems with extrajudicial endings. He agrees with. He does this in many novels. He lets, the murderer get away. He lets the murderer commit suicide. I know this doesn't make for like dramatic moments, but this is the proper, correct ending where Poirot is involved. He doesn't even really give it a second thought at all. Let's get into our murderers. We have 12 of them, plus the Countess as an accomplice. Hector McQueen is one of the more prominent characters. I would guess he's probably like the main ringleader in all of this. I know it said everyone had more or less equal hand in everything, but that's not really true. And McQueen seemed to be like the designated leader, and I did not find him that interesting. I honestly couldn't tell you a lot about his personality. I think he's one of the lesser quality characters, if I'm being honest. I think there are issues with him. I don't understand why he's using his real name around Ratchet. Surely Ratchet, being a mobster, who knows how to escape justice, knows his prosecutor's children. But he seems a very capable and intelligent person. There are a lot of these like male secretaries to rich men in Christie, and they're all pretty much the same, like competent, nice guys, but like not very interesting as characters. I think he did a good job, planning this as could be expected. He insulates himself very well. I don't have a lot to say about him other than I assume he's the one speaking the French in Ratchet's cabin that Poirot hears. I also suspect he's at least a pretty big contender here for the person who actually delivered the fatal blow to Ratchet. Part of the plot is that everyone stabs him at a different time, so no one will know who actually killed Cassetti. I would like to explore this in a future video to see if I can determine who delivered the fatal blow. I think it can be solved, and I suspect McQueen is a pretty big front runner since he was in the cabin earlier in the night and is one of the stronger physical people. Mrs. Hubbard is slash Linda Arden is the other main character from the bunch. I look at everyone else as more or less unequal playing field, like from a novel perspective. And Mrs. Hubbard is a fantastic character. I think she's the best character in the book. She's one of Christie's best characters of all time. Linda Arden is expertly playing the role of the obnoxious American tourist we know Christie encountered a lot on her travels. She talks about them in her personal writings and like her autobiography and Come Tell Me How You Live. Mrs. Hubbard constantly going on and on about her daughter, and her daughter said to do this and not to do this, and this will happen. Comic relief for sure, but also a very tragic figure. Christie expertly pulls this off. The transition from Mrs. Hubbard, hysterical traveler, to Linda Arden, tragic, grieving mother and grandmother, is extremely difficult to pull off, and Christie does it beautifully. If we reflect back after the reveal, Mrs. Hubbard talking about her daughter so much, she's talking about Sonia Armstrong, and she's having memories of Sonia. And she's not talking about a fictional daughter or the Countess Andreni. She's referencing Sonia constantly. Her role in the murder is very risky. She has the connecting door with Ratchet, which is a clue. It doesn't really get stated here, but generally speaking, cabins like that would be reserved for like a family or a couple or passengers of the same gender if possible. But she puts herself in danger by taking the bigger risks. From a practical standpoint, she's the most likely suspect because she has the most access to Ratchet. She has the biggest motive since it was her daughter and her granddaughter he murdered. She talks on a she takes on a bigger role than most of the others do. And she's also willing, even eager to take the fall for the murder. Of course, that was never going to happen, but she does make mistakes, especially with the lock. She's the physical embodiment of the typical Christie theme that people reveal too much when they talk too much. But I found her to be the best and most memorable character in this book. Mary Debenham is in the vein of our more traditional Christie heroine, though weirdly she's not the main focus, but she's a great character. I love how Christie depicts the tension between her and Poirot. She really resents him, certainly more than anyone else on the train does, and probably more than most other Christie murderers do. She does not appreciate the prying into her social life and her relationship with the Colonel, which provides a major clue. She was Sonia's secretary and governess to Countess Indreni, which I always think the two women as the same age. I guess Mary is older. I believe the book mentions she's 26 and Helena is 21. I always found that strange. I think Mary is one of the best characters in the book. She provides a lot of intrigue early on while Poirot is still on the Orient Express. I've never been a fan of how Christie makes her obviously important. I mean, that conversation with Arbuthnot early on is something that stands out early and keeps getting mentioned like a little too much. It's the Chekhov's gun, a bit obvious. I think it's a little too clear this is going to factor in at some point. But again, I think this is a novel where Christie can lay out her cards a little more than usual and is one where I don't think she minds if it's solved early or if the reader gets onto her. Colonel Arbuthnot, I may have referred to him as a captain a few times. That was me misspeaking. I love the cluing with him because he's the typical stodgy Christie trope of a British military officer. He's supposed to be cold, but he's warm to Mary Debenham, and he calls her Mary, and I love that clue. I love when Christie uses characters' personalities as clues. And he's a pretty major character as well, certainly one of the more important of the bunch. He initially denies knowing John Armstrong, and he says he knows a bunch of Armstrongs, and he goes off long winded stories like his archetype is prone to do. But he did know Daisy's father, who was British. They served in the war together, and Armstrong saved his life. I think Arbuthnot has a lot more depth to him than a lot of these other retired British military men do in Christie. He had emotions and feelings. He fell in love. He wasn't like a complete bore. I use that term bore affectionately. I always like the ending where Poirot gets very tense with Mary and Arbuthnot threatens to break every bone in Poirot's body. And he's a pretty big suspect because of the pipe cleaners, which I think shows his gentlemanly and chivalrous nature. He's putting himself at risk of being incriminated, do the honorable thing here, protecting the women and the innocent. I would imagine he would have sacrificed himself to save the group if he was called upon to do so. We never get there, but I think he probably would have. Princess Dragomirov was a good character. She's often described as decrepit, yellow, and ugly, but she has a strong sense of character and dignity. She did not pull rank as a princess or object to being searched and whatnot because her advanced age. I think she knows she can do this because she's not going to get suspected. She's not strong enough to stab Ratchet. She definitely delivered one of those like weaker blows that was described as a scratch. I always found this a bit strange. Now, I've never stabbed anyone before, but I would think it's like not that difficult to break the skin at least. I mean, one of the wounds didn't even do that. She uses her handkerchief as a clue, again, knowing she's never going to be a suspect. She also freely admits that she's friends with the Armstrongs, which I think is ideal. As someone as well known as Princess Dragomirov, her connection is probably public knowledge. No sense in hiding it. She's never like truly a serious suspect in the minds of readers, despite all of this evidence against her. And she's careful to stay away from her friend like Linda Arden, also because that makes a lot of sense. Her calming and open presence almost irritates Poirot as he expects her to put up more of a fight and almost finds her like too easy to deal with. Greta Olson is the only Christie character at the time of this recording whose depiction won an Academy Award. It's sort of weird it wasn't from a more prominent character, but Ingrid Bergman deserved it. One thing I think is easy to forget about her is that her English is not good. Poirot and her converse mostly in French, although she does speak some English. She was the nurse in the Armstrong house, and she still is a nurse. I found her to be a good character. She's very religious, although that mostly comes up more in the adaptations and often effectively. I think her presence on the train and her piety really bring home just how horrible Cassetti was. If someone like Greta Olson thinks he should be killed, he must be pretty terrible. She is responsible, I would say, partly responsible for the group being caught. The lock mistake is her doing. It was all practiced ahead of time, and she makes the mistake of saying the bolt was locked when it's very clear that was just routine. Like, she didn't look because she would have noticed the lock was visible. It doesn't matter if it was locked or not. But, she didn't notice Mrs. Hubbard's error. She really seemed really scatterbrained at times, although I suspect that was probably mostly an act. Like when Poirot was giving his, summation gathering there, she seems a lot more alert, a lot more attentive. I think it was probably a scatterbrained act going on. Antonio Foscarelli was the Armstrong chauffeur. I very much appreciated the redemption he gets from Christie. And most of the novel, he's basically a punchline for Book to complain about Italians, and he gets a lot of shadiness thrown his way. All of it's false. It's still not great that he gets this depiction, like how the stabbing was his idea, and the one who's just like everyone have a hand in it. He also, it's a bit obnoxious talking about cars, but he was very Mrs. Hubbard like when talking about Fords. I really liked Foscarelli. He has a very nice moment when he remembers Daisy sitting on his lap and pretending to drive the car and calling him Tonio. For me, it makes sense why Foscarelli joins in with this plot and why he's so motivated because of his connection with Daisy. I think he could have been one of the more unlikely conspirators, so I was glad his backstory with Daisy was included to give him that motivation outside of just being a vengeful Italian. Like some of the other characters, they're like, oh, they were just servants in the house. Like they don't mention any particularly strong connection that would motivate them to do this. So I was glad Foscarelli got that at least. Pierre Michel is the reason why this plot happens. He's Suzanne's father and already worked on the Calais coach of the Orient Express prior to the events of the kidnapping. He was, for me, the most important person mechanics wise. If you remember my video on how to solve a mystery novel, one of the things to look out for is the person who is in the position to make the murder happen, the person who can ensure the conditions are right for the murder to be pulled off, and that is Pierre Michel in this book. He's the one who can make it happen. Outside of that, I did not find him a particularly interesting character. There's no real indication his daughter is Suzanne either, other than Poirot knows Pierre is involved somehow, so that must be the connection. I know in the 1974 film has him be the final person to stab Ratchet, although I think in the book he is a pretty big contender to be the first. Interestingly, there is also a Pierre Michel who works on the Blue Train as a train attendant in The Mystery of the Blue Train. I don't think this is the same character. I looked this up, and the Agatha Christie wiki says it's not the same character. I don't want to see why it couldn't be, though. I mean, what are the odds of there being two Pierre Michels who work as conductors on luxury trains? But, I still did not find Pierre Michel a dud. He was interesting and because he had took on this larger role. He wasn't a dud, unlike the next three people I'll be talking about. Masterman was Ratchet's valet and John Armstrong's Batman during the war. I couldn't tell you a single character trait of Masterman's. He had a toothache. I don't think he brought much of anything to the book entertainment wise or personality wise or even to the actual murder plot. He was extraneous with no role to play, and what little he did was overshadowed by the things other people were doing. He's in Ratchet's employ, but so is McQueen, whose position is more integral to the plot. I just don't have a lot to say about Masterman. He was there because Christine needed 12 people, and he didn't really seem to have much to do outside of that. Same thing with Hildegard Schmidt, a complete dud. I couldn't really tell you anything about her. At least she had a role to play, as she claimed to see the small man with the womanish voice. And she does have minor character moments, like her not saying it was the princess's handkerchief on the ground, but there's just not a lot there. She's introduced very late into the book. She was the Armstrong cook, which Poirot figures out in a really odd way about him asking her about cooking for her lady she served, which to me implies that Poirot already knew she was a cook before he asked that, which is a really illogical leap there. I think it's a real question of whether or not she really is Princess Dracomirov's lady in waiting. Like, is she a cook? Is she a lady in waiting? Poirot says ladies in waiting don't cook, and he also finds it odd the princess didn't have a French lady's maid. I really couldn't tell you anything about her. I mean, she gets lost in the shuffle of all the other characters, and we don't even know like of her existence until she gets interviewed, or at least till the princess gets interviewed, which is well past like the halfway point of the novel. And the final dud is Cyrus Hardman. He's less of a dud than Masterman and Schmidt, but I really couldn't tell you anything about him personality wise. I did enjoy his stereotypical gruff gumshoe lingo, so that's something. Very American detective. He did a lot of the background research to get the murder plot going. He really is a private detective, which I think helped him a lot. He was able to get into Ratchet's good graces and be hired by him to do the exact opposite job of what he did. I think there's a better character than like the other does, and it's like slightly more important, but we saw very little of him. Like, he's the one who's able to keep his connection to the Armstrongs the secret longest, even so much so that Poirot consults with him toward the end of the novel, where he fails to mislead Poirot. He was in love with Suzanne, which Poirot figures out because Hardman seems like a guy who likes French women. I have no idea what that means, and I think that's a pretty good indication of Hardman's not so good characterization, because Christie doesn't foreshadow this connection to the Armstrongs in a believable way like she does with like Foscarelli. It just seemed like, oh, she needed a connection here. Here it is. And our final juror is Count Rudolph Andrenyi, and I liked him as a character. I found him like paradoxically incredibly intelligent and also a bit ignorant. He's a shrewd character and exudes masculinity in a very positive, supportive way. It's not made explicitly clear, but I'm sort of under the impression he did not meet his wife until after the events of the kidnapping, and he's still being the the chivalrous husband. We know they married after the kidnapping. We don't know when they met, but he's very short-sighted and has a bit of a temper with Poirot. His attempts to prove his wife innocent and keep suspicion off her are clumsy and only do the exact opposite of that. They bring attention to her. I also question their denial of knowing the Armstrongs when they are well known people whose connection is very public. He's a nobleman and an ambassador, and I've talked about his honor and his word meaning everything. And with a character like him, I think we can trust his word when he says the Countess was not involved. And I'll lump the Countess in here with the murderers, as she's technically an accomplice. She does not stab Ratchet, but she is in on the plan. And I question why she was on the train to begin with. I guess it's because it would look weird if her husband was traveling alone, but if the point was to make sure she isn't implicated at all, the easiest way to do that is to make sure she isn't on the Orient Express. The Countess is a very tragic figure, Ophelia, very Ophelia like from Hamlet. She doesn't really partake in any of the plotting except for the covering up of her own name, but I did find her an interesting character, the symbol of hope for the future. I know we're supposed to think Arbuthnot and Mary are supposed to be, but I view the Andrenis as that. The young couple likely starting a family soon. The video game adaptation that came out in 2023 that I did review on this channel ends the story with her being pregnant, and I sort of like, ever since I played that game, I sort of always think of her as pregnant now at the end of this book. I think that would be very fitting. Moving on to our victim slash murderer in his own right, Ratchet slash Cassetti, who is an all-time great evil personality. I mean, that moment when Poirot refuses Ratchet's job because he doesn't like his face is so chilling. It's one of the greatest moments in any Christie novel. Poirot also calls him a beautiful but dangerous caged animal. Such a vivid and perfect description. I think he's a great murderer. I love an evil murderer. And we see so little of Ratchet, but we know so much about him, and there's never a positive description or trait given to him. I do think as a character, though, is a little bit off at times. Like, he's a little too cryptic when, like, speaking with Poirot and Hardman for no reason. I've always wondered, like, did he recognize, like, McQueen and some of the others? Like, surely he encountered some of these people when he was, like, studying the house or casing out the joint or whatever. we're not really privy to a lot of the details of the kidnapping of this book, but a lot of the adaptations do change that. But I do find it difficult to believe he didn't notice like some of the names at least. But still, Ratchet's like the perfect jerk ass victim who got what was coming for him. An absolutely iconic Christie victim, in my opinion. And we have two other characters to discuss. First up is Mr. Book. Book or Book. I've never been 100% on the pronunciation of his name. I do know, however, that he's an elderly Frenchman who definitely does not look like Tom Bateman. I have to throw one more sling at Kenneth Branagh's adaptation here, which is somehow the best of the trilogy. Very much Book is our equivalent of the generic police inspector, even though he's not a policeman. I did not find Book to be the biggest personality, but he provides a lot of stability and is someone Poirot trusts and he can bounce things off of. He mostly just reaffirms what we already know and is almost a yes man to Poirot. Outside of his constant anti Italian slinging, I am Italian American, by the way, so you don't think I can let this go. He really didn't have a lot of personality, especially compared to, like, Dr. Constantine. And speaking of Dr. Constantine, I forgot how interesting he could be. I particularly like this moment when Poirot asks Book and Constantine to mull over the information and to see if they can come up with anything. And instead of doing that, Dr. Constantine just starts fantasizing about this married woman he's having an affair with. He was much more vibrant than I had remembered. I always thought of him as like the generic police doctor. I believe it's the Suchet series adaptation of this that actually has Dr. Constantine be one of the conspirators, and I think that works. Like, he's Greek, a nationality not represented, and as a doctor, he can fudge the medical information. He's also described as a small, dark man, like that mysterious train engineer or conductor rather. And one does wonder, like, if maybe there's more to the story here. Perhaps a conspiracy that he's one of the conspirators. I could probably do a whole conspiracy slash unanswered video solely on Murder on the Orient Express. But I did find Dr. Constantine to be a fun character, especially given his role, which is usually not a particularly fun one. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about Murder on the Orient Express. I pretty much already know what most of you think about it. I know I had this ranked number 8 of 33 Poirots, which would knock it out of the top 10 on a full list. I would definitely move it up. It's absurd to be that low. I maintain my criticisms of this novel are valid, but this is a top tier, all time great novel. Not even a mystery novel, just a novel. I would probably move it up to like 4 or 5. I don't think it's better than Roger Ackroyd, Death on the Nile, or even Peril at Hen House. Maybe Peril at Hen House, but it's definitely better than ABC Murders, After the Funeral, and Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which I enjoy more, but they need to be below Orient Express. Five Little Pigs is iffy, but I think about 4 or 5 is about right here, and that would probably keep it in the top 10 on a full list of all 66 novels. I also didn't realize 2024 was the 50th anniversary of the Albert Finney film adaptation of Orient Express. Otherwise, I would have reviewed that this year. I will review that at some point, don't worry. Next week is a new year and new beginnings, so why not discuss the best Christie novel beginnings? This could be, an opening chapter, a segment, a passage, a page, a line, whatever. I was inconsistent here, but it will be a lot of fun nonetheless. Until next time, Mystery Files, and Happy New Year.